We had been married for over a decade, and on the surface, everything appeared perfect. My wife, Emma, and I had the kind of relationship people envied. We both worked demanding jobs, but we always found time for each other. Our evenings consisted of cooking dinner together, watching shows, or just talking about our day. I guess you could say we had a rhythm, a routine, a comfort that made life feel predictable and stable. Emma was a beautiful woman, though she would never openly admit it. She was in her mid-30s, tall, slender, with soft brown hair that cascaded over her shoulders. People often commented on how striking she was, but she always just shrugged it off. She had a quiet confidence about her that made me adore her more than words could describe. I always felt lucky that I had found someone who shared my values and priorities in life. I worked in finance, which meant I spent long hours at the office, constantly dealing with numbers and managing portfolios. Emma, on the other hand, was an architect. She was meticulous, creative, and detail-oriented. We both had our separate worlds, but we also had a life we built together. We traveled, we laughed, we supported each other through life's ups and downs. But what I didn't know was that something had been slowly unraveling beneath the surface, something I hadn't noticed. I thought everything was fine, even though recently, I started sensing a shift in Emma's behavior. It wasn't anything drastic, but there were moments where I could tell she was preoccupied. She would get home late more often, cancel plans, or just seem distant. At first, I brushed it off. Work was stressful for both of us, and maybe she was just overwhelmed with her latest project. But as time passed, I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. There were tiny little changes I couldn't quite pinpoint, like how she was spending more time on her phone, or how she would go for walks alone, leaving me to eat dinner by myself. I tried to talk to her about it, but she'd always assure me everything was fine, that it was just work or stress. She never seemed to want to delve deeper. And like the good husband I thought I was, I believed her. But doubts started creeping in, like an uninvited guest at the back of my mind. I couldn't help but wonder, was it possible that something else was going on? Then one evening, everything came crashing down. Our home, nestled in the suburbs, had always been our sanctuary. I used to walk in the front door after a long day, and the smell of whatever Emma was cooking would waft through the air. She loved experimenting in the kitchen, always excited to try some new recipe she'd stumbled across. Lately, though, the house had felt colder. The warmth that had defined our relationship seemed to be fading, replaced by an unspoken tension. It wasn't something I could put my finger on immediately. Emma still smiled at me, still kissed me on the cheek before heading out in the mornings. But there was a distance between us, a subtle shift that felt like a canyon growing wider with every passing day. Our once effortless conversations felt forced, and I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. Then came the odd behaviors. She started dressing up more often, something I hadn't noticed at first. Emma always cared about her appearance, but now she was spending extra time on her hair and makeup, even for casual errands. She said it made her feel good, and I didn't think much of it at the time. But then there were the phone calls, one she would take in another room, speaking in hushed tones. If I walked in, she'd quickly hang up or change the subject. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. People deserve privacy, and Emma had never given me a reason to distrust her. Still, the gnawing unease in my stomach wouldn't go away. I decided to give her space, to focus on my work, and trust that whatever was bothering her would eventually surface. But instead of easing my concerns, the distance between us seemed to grow. She started staying out late, saying she was meeting coworkers for drinks or working on a last-minute project at the office. She'd come home smelling faintly of wine and perfume, her demeanor cheerful but oddly detached. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd smile and say, "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" I tried to ignore the red flags, convincing myself that I was overthinking. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe she needed some time to reconnect with herself. After all, relationships go through ups and downs, right? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, little by little. One evening, as we sat on the couch, her phone buzzed. I glanced over and saw her quickly flip it over, face down on the coffee table. It was a small thing, but it felt like a punch to the gut. Why was she hiding her screen from me? "Who's that?" I asked casually, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, just a message from work," she replied, brushing it off. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't like her to be secretive. And that's when I realized something had changed. I couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. For the first time, I began to wonder if there was something, or someone, she wasn't telling me about. I spent the next few weeks pretending everything was normal, even though I was anything but calm inside. Every smile Emma gave me, every moment of laughter we shared, felt like a performance. I started to notice every little thing she did. The way her phone seemed glued to her hand. How she'd get more defensive about her schedule when I asked simple questions. And the subtle way she'd avoid making plans with me, always saying she had something going on. One night, I decided to stay late at the office to catch up on some overdue reports. It was unusual for me since I typically made an effort to leave on time and have dinner with Emma. When I told her, she didn't seem disappointed. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. "That's fine," she said quickly, as though she'd been waiting for me to say I wouldn't be home. I lingered in the parking lot after finishing work, my car idling as I wrestled with my thoughts. A part of me wanted to believe I was imagining things. Emma had been my partner for years, my confidant, my best friend. But there was another part, a darker voice, whispering that something was seriously wrong. When I got home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. The lights were on, but Emma wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. I called out her name, and she appeared from the bedroom, her hair tousled and her face flushed. "You're home earlier than I expected," she said, her voice just a little too high-pitched. "I finished up faster than I thought," I replied, scanning her face for any sign of guilt. She gave me a quick smile and brushed past me to the kitchen, saying she'd heat up some leftovers for dinner. I watched her, feeling like I was seeing a stranger. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and scenarios I didn't want to consider. Was I being paranoid? Or was Emma hiding something from me? I replayed every interaction we'd had over the last few months, looking for clues, signs that I had missed. The next day, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how often she was texting when she thought I wasn't looking. I began tracking her social media posts, noticing subtle inconsistencies in her stories about where she'd been. And then there were the phone calls, brief and cryptic, always ending abruptly when I walked into the room. It felt like I was unraveling. I hated the person I was becoming, the suspicious husband spying on his wife. But I couldn't stop. The more I observed, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. I needed answers, but I didn't know how to get them without crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. One evening, while Emma was in the shower, I saw her phone sitting on the bathroom counter. My heart raced as I stood outside the door, debating whether to pick it up. I could feel the weight of the decision, the line I was about to cross. But before I could act, the water shut off, and I quickly walked away, my heart pounding. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. I needed to find out the truth, even if it destroyed me. It was a Friday night when I first saw it. Emma had mentioned earlier in the week that she was meeting some coworkers for drinks, a casual team bonding event at a bar downtown. She had smiled at me as she left, her hair styled to perfection, wearing the red dress I'd always loved on her. I told her she looked amazing, and she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before walking out the door. The evening passed slowly. I tried to distract myself by watching a movie, but I couldn't stop glancing at my phone. Hours ticked by, and she didn't send any messages. Normally, Emma would text to check in or let me know when she'd be home. But that night, there was nothing. Around 11 p.m., I finally sent her a text. "Hey, how's it going? Let me know when you're heading back." It sat on delivered for nearly an hour without a response. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe her phone was on silent, or maybe she'd left it in her bag. But deep down, I felt a weight settle in my chest, a foreboding sense of unease I couldn't shake. When Emma came home, it was well past midnight. I was still awake, sitting in the living room pretending to read a book. She looked surprised to see me. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice light, almost too casual. "Yeah," I said, closing the book and standing. "I wanted to make sure you got home okay. How was it?" She hesitated, just for a moment. "It was fine. We stayed longer than I expected, but it was fun. Who all was there? I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Oh, the usual group, she said quickly, kicking off her heels. You don't know most of them. I didn't press further, even though something about her answer didn't sit right with me. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her cheeks were flushed, but not in the way they usually were after a night out. She smelled faintly of perfume, but it wasn't hers. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I noticed it. As she headed to bed, I stayed behind, my mind spinning. My instincts were screaming that something was off, but I had no proof, just a growing pit of doubt that I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I tried to shake the feeling, but more things started to pile up. She was on her phone constantly, her screen tilted away from me when she texted. When I asked if she wanted to go out for dinner one evening, she hesitated, saying she wasn't feeling well. But later, I noticed her putting on makeup before heading out to run errands. It wasn't long before I started piecing things together. Her late nights, her defensiveness, her secretive behavior. It all painted a picture I didn't want to believe. My mind began running wild with possibilities. Was it someone at work? A random stranger? Then, one evening, as she stepped into the shower, she left her phone unlocked on the counter. I stared at it for a moment, my heart pounding. I knew it was wrong, an invasion of privacy, but the temptation was overwhelming. I picked it up and opened her messages. Most of them were mundane, conversations with friends and family. But then I saw a name I didn't recognize, a man named Paul. Their texts were brief, but unmistakably flirtatious. A message from him stood out, "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." My stomach dropped. I didn't know who he was or what last night meant, but I suddenly felt like I couldn't breathe. I put the phone back where I'd found it, my hands trembling. Emma had lied to me. She had been with someone else. The realization hit me like a freight train. The life we had built together, the trust one thought we shared, it was all a lie. And now, I had to figure out what to do with the shards of my broken reality. After discovering the texts, my mind went into overdrive. Who was Paul? How long had this been going on? And what exactly had last night entailed? My stomach churned every time I thought about it. Part of me wanted to confront Emma immediately, to demand answers, but another part of me wasn't ready to hear the truth. What if I was wrong? What if there was some innocent explanation? I buried myself in work, trying to distract myself, but it didn't help. Every time I saw Emma, my chest tightened. She seemed so normal, so unaffected. It was like nothing had changed for her, while my entire world was crumbling. The guilt and anger brewed beneath the surface, but I forced myself to keep it together. I started watching her more closely. It felt wrong, spying on my wife, analyzing her every move, but I couldn't stop. I noticed how often she'd check her phone, smiling faintly at her screen when she thought I wasn't looking. She was texting Paul. I was sure of it. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, her phone buzzed. She picked it up and angled the screen away from me, her fingers quickly typing out a reply. My heart raced, but I said nothing. I hated the person I was becoming, suspicious, paranoid, consumed by doubts, but I couldn't stop. Who's that? I asked casually, my voice steady. Just work stuff, she replied, not looking up. Work stuff. I wanted to laugh, but instead, I just nodded. My stomach twisted in knots as I watched her put the phone back down. I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of my suspicions and the silence I was keeping. That weekend, Emma said she was going to meet an old friend for lunch. She didn't mention who, but something about the way she avoided eye contact made my pulse quicken. After she left, I grabbed my keys and decided to follow her. I felt sick with guilt, but I had to know the truth. I stayed a few cars behind as she drove across town. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario. When she finally pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe, I parked far enough away to stay out of sight. She stepped out of the car, her face lit up with a smile that felt like a dagger in my chest. A man got out of a car a few spots away, and they met in the middle. I watched as they hugged, too long, too close, and walked inside together. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I sat there, watching my wife disappear into the cafe with another man. I didn't follow them inside. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there in my car, staring at the entrance, feeling like the walls of my life were caving in. There it was, the confirmation I had dreaded. Emma was seeing someone else. When she came home that evening, she was cheerful, as though nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day was, her voice light and carefree. I smiled back, my stomach churning, and told her it had been fine. Inside, I was screaming. In the days that followed, the weight of what I had seen at the cafe pressed down on me. I replayed the moment Emma hugged that man, Paul, I assumed, over and over in my mind. Each time, it felt like a fresh wound, deeper than the last. I began to feel like a stranger in my own marriage, trapped in a cruel play where everyone knew their lines except me. Emma's behavior didn't change much. She continued her routine as though everything was normal, which only made it harder for me. How could she act so nonchalant? Didn't she feel even a shred of guilt? Her ability to hide the affair made me question everything I thought I knew about her. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more than just a hug in a parking lot or vague texts on her phone. If I accused her without concrete proof, she'd deny everything, twist the narrative, and make me look paranoid. I couldn't let that happen. So, I started planning. Quietly, methodically, I began gathering information. I wasn't proud of the steps I was taking, but I didn't see any other way. I searched online for discreet surveillance options and eventually ordered a set of hidden cameras. The guilt gnawed at me as I installed them while Emma was out, placing them strategically in common areas of the house. The living room, the kitchen, and even our bedroom. Every click of the camera casing felt like a betrayal of the man I used to be, the trusting husband who would have laughed at the idea of spying on his wife. But that man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Once the cameras were in place, I waited. Days turned into a week, then 2. Emma's late nights continued, her excuses growing flimsier with each passing day. She'd leave the house in a rush, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, always saying she was meeting friends or running errands. Then, one Friday evening, she said she was heading to a coworker's farewell party. She left in a black dress I'd never seen before, her makeup flawless. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile, kissing me lightly on the cheek. As soon as she was out the door, I opened my laptop and logged into the camera feed. The house was empty now, silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. I felt a flicker of guilt for spying on her like this, but it was quickly drowned out by the need for answers. Hours passed with nothing but static silence on the feed. I was starting to think maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe Emma really had gone to that party. But then, just after midnight, I saw her. The front door opened, and Emma walked in, followed by a man I didn't recognize. It was Paul. I watched as they laughed quietly, their voices low but unmistakably intimate. They moved into the living room, and my heart clenched as she reached for his hand, pulling him toward the couch. I shut the laptop, unable to watch anymore. My hands trembled as a surge of anger and pain washed over me. There it was, the undeniable proof I had been dreading. Emma was cheating on me, and she had brought him into our home, into the life we had built together. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? Confront her? Call her out on her lies? Or let the betrayal fester, swallowing me whole? The storm that had been brewing for weeks had finally broken, and I was standing in the eye of it, unsure of what to do next. The sight of Emma with Paul in our living room haunted me. I replayed the scene in my head, the laughter, the touch, the intimacy that once belonged to us but now seemed like a distant memory. That night, I barely slept. My mind churned with anger, confusion, and a deep, hollow sadness. How could she do this to me? To us? I knew I had to act, but I couldn't rush into it. Confronting her now would only give her the chance to deny everything, to twist the narrative in her favor. I needed more evidence, more control over the situation. If this was going to end, it had to be on my terms. The next morning, Emma acted as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with a smile, kissed me on the forehead, and asked if I wanted pancakes for breakfast. I nodded numbly, watching her move around the kitchen as though she hadn't betrayed me just hours earlier. It was surreal, like living in an alternate reality where she could effortlessly compartmentalize her double life. After breakfast, I pretended to head out for errands, but instead parked a few blocks away, my laptop in tow. I reviewed the footage from the cameras again, confirming what I had seen the night before. Every interaction between Emma and Paul felt like another knife in my chest. Her laughter, her gestures, the way she leaned into him. It was all so familiar, yet entirely foreign. That afternoon, I took my plan a step further. I reached out to a friend of mine, a tech-savvy coworker who owed me a favor. I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed a better way to monitor activity at home. He helped me install a more advanced system that would send real-time alerts to my phone whenever there was movement in the house. It felt extreme, but I was past the point of caring. I needed to know. Over the next few days, I started noticing patterns. Emma would claim to be working late or out with friends, but the alerts told a different story. Paul would show up at the house shortly after I left for work, or during the evenings when she thought I wasn't paying attention. They were careful, though, never staying too long, never leaving any obvious traces. It was as if they knew the importance of covering their tracks. One night, as I lay in bed pretending to be asleep, I heard Emma whispering into her phone. Her voice was low, but I could make out fragments of the conversation. Soon, I miss you, and we'll figure it out. My jaw clenched, and I forced myself to stay still, feigning sleep as tears burned in my eyes. That was the moment I realized I couldn't wait much longer. I needed to confront her, but I also needed to protect myself. I began preparing, documenting everything I could, gathering screenshots, timestamps, and video clips. I even met with a lawyer to discuss my options, ensuring that I would have the upper hand when the time came. The weight of the deception was crushing, but I held on to the one thing that kept me going, the knowledge that I would get through this. Emma's betrayal had broken something inside me, but it hadn't destroyed me entirely. Not yet. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't go down without a fight. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Every moment with Emma felt like a lie, every smile, every word steeped in deception. I wanted to confront her so many times, to scream at her for what she'd done, but I kept holding back. I needed to see it through, to ensure I had everything I needed before the inevitable explosion. Then came the night that changed everything. Emma told me she was meeting her coworkers again. Another farewell party, or so she claimed. Her lies were almost laughable now, as though she didn't even care to put effort into them. I nodded, feigning indifference, and watched her leave. This time, I wasn't just going to sit back and wait. I logged into the camera feed and prepared myself for what I might see. It didn't take long. About 20 minutes after she left, the front door opened, and Paul stepped inside. He moved like he belonged there, comfortable and confident. I clenched my fists as I watched him drop a small duffel bag by the door. He looked around briefly before heading to the kitchen. Emma returned shortly after, dressed more casually than when she'd left. She had changed somewhere, likely at Paul's place. They greeted each other with a kiss, a deep, passionate kiss that left no doubt about their relationship. My stomach churned, and I felt the walls of my world collapse around me. They made themselves comfortable in the living room, laughing and talking like they were on a date. Seeing them like that, so at ease in my home, filled me with a fury I'd never known. I watched as they moved from the couch to the bedroom, their laughter echoing through the house. I closed the laptop, unable to stomach any more. But instead of breaking down, I found myself eerily calm. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading, but also the moment I needed to set my plan into motion. I called a friend of mine, someone I trusted implicitly. He was a private investigator, someone who specialized in cases like this. I'd contacted him weeks earlier, explaining my situation, and he'd been waiting for my signal. Now it was time to bring him in. Tonight, I said. I need everything documented. Got it, he replied. I'll be there in 20. I stayed parked a few blocks away, my pulse steady, my breathing even. I didn't feel the heartbreak anymore, just a cold, calculating resolve. If Emma wanted to destroy the life we'd built, then I would make sure she faced the consequences. When my investigator arrived, we quietly entered the house. Emma and Paul were still in the bedroom, their laughter faint but audible. My investigator started taking pictures, capturing every detail. Their clothes on the floor, the intimate setup they'd created in my absence. We waited until he had enough evidence, then I signaled him to leave. That's when I stepped forward, my heart pounding as I opened the bedroom door. The look on Emma's face when she saw me was a mix of shock and horror. Paul froze, his mouth hanging open as he scrambled to cover himself with the blanket. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice cold and steady. "Wait," Emma stammered, her face pale. "It's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I interrupted, holding up my phone, still recording. "Don't even try to lie." Paul tried to speak, but I cut him off. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice low and venomous. "Now." He hesitated, but the look in my eyes must have convinced him. He grabbed his clothes and stumbled out of the room, muttering apologies as he went. Emma sat on the bed, trembling, tears streaming down her face. "We need to talk," I said, my voice heavy with finality. "But first, I need you to know one thing. It's over. Whatever you thought we had, it's done." She tried to speak, but I held up a hand. "Save it. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself when my lawyer gets in touch." I walked out, leaving her sitting there, broken and speechless. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, a clarity that I hadn't known I was capable of. But the storm was far from over. The night after confronting Emma, I sat in the silence of my car, parked outside a cheap motel. The confrontation had left me drained, but there was a strange clarity in my exhaustion. Emma had shattered the life we'd built, but I wasn't going to let her take my dignity along with it. If she thought she could humiliate me without consequence, she was wrong. A part of me had already decided how I would respond. It wasn't out of spite, at least, that's what I told myself, but out of a need to reclaim some control over the chaos she had caused. If Emma could rewrite the rules of our marriage, so could I. That week, I started seeing someone. Her name was Sophie, a woman I'd met months earlier at a conference. She was vibrant, intelligent, and unapologetically confident. We'd kept in touch casually, exchanging the occasional email or social media comment, but I'd always thought of her as an acquaintance. Until now, I reached out to Sophie under the guise of professional networking, inviting her to coffee. The moment she walked into the cafe, her warm smile and easy laugh made me forget my misery, if only for a little while. We talked for hours, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. I didn't tell her about Emma at first. I wasn't ready to open that wound. But as our meetings became more frequent, I found myself confiding in her. Sophie listened without judgment, her eyes soft with empathy as I shared the betrayal that had upended my life. She didn't try to fix me or offer hollow platitudes. She simply sat with me in my pain, making me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. It didn't take long for our connection to deepen. I hadn't planned for it, hadn't expected it, but there was no denying the pull between us. One evening, as we sat in her car after dinner, she leaned in and kissed me. It was gentle, tentative, yet it lit a fire inside me that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't feel guilty. Not anymore. Emma had made her choices, and now I was making mine. Back at home, Emma tried to reach out, her attempts at reconciliation growing more desperate by the day. She apologized endlessly, promising that what she'd done was a mistake, that she'd been confused and lost. I didn't believe a word of it. Her tears didn't move me anymore. They felt like a performance, a last-ditch effort to salvage the life she'd so recklessly destroyed. I kept my interactions with Emma civil but distant. She didn't know about Sophie, and I didn't feel the need to tell her. This was my life now, my way of moving forward, even if it wasn't the most honorable path. If Emma had taught me anything, it was that honor was overrated when survival was on the line. One night, as Emma tried to initiate a conversation, I calmly shut her down. "You made your choices," I said, my voice steady. "Now I'm making mine." She looked at me, confused and hurt, but I didn't elaborate. Let her wonder. Let her feel the same uncertainty and betrayal I had endured. As I drove to Sophie's that evening, I felt a strange mix of emotions: exhilaration, defiance, and an unfamiliar sense of freedom. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was no longer a victim. I was reclaiming my life, one step at a time. But deep down, I knew this path wouldn't come without its own consequences. Days turned into weeks, and the fragile facade of normalcy Emma was trying to maintain began to crack. She grew more desperate, her pleas for forgiveness becoming more frequent and emotional. At first, I ignored her, focusing on my own healing and my newfound connection with Sophie. But Emma was relentless. One evening, I came home to find Emma sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She didn't bother to hide it this time. A glass of wine sat untouched in front of her, and she looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of guilt and despair. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice trembling. I sighed, setting my keys down on the counter. "What is there to talk about, Emma? You made your choices." "I know," she said quickly. "I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need to explain. I need you to understand." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I considered walking away. But a part of me, curious, angry, or maybe just exhausted, decided to hear her out. "Fine," I said, crossing my arms and leaning against the counter. "Go ahead." Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "I didn't plan for this to happen. He was just someone I talked to. At first, it was harmless." I raised an eyebrow, my skepticism clear. "Harmless? You brought him into our home, Emma." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I crossed every line, and I hate myself for it. But I was lonely, okay? You were always working late, always distracted. I felt invisible." Her words hit me like a slap. Part of me wanted to scoff, to remind her that I'd been working hard for us, for our future. But another part, the part that still remembered how much I'd loved her, felt a pang of guilt. Had I been neglecting her without realizing it? "That doesn't excuse what you did," I said, my voice cold. "You could have talked to me. You could have told me how you felt. Instead, you chose to cheat." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I regret it more than you'll ever know. I ruined everything, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm asking for it anyway." I stared at her, my emotions a storm of anger, sadness, and confusion. "I can't just forget what you did," I said finally. "You didn't just betray me, Emma. You destroyed my trust, our marriage, everything we built together." Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I don't even know if I can." For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of her with Paul, laughing, kissing, betraying me in the most intimate way possible. I couldn't go back, not after everything. "I don't think this is something you can fix," I said quietly. "I'm done, Emma. I've already started the divorce process." Her head shot up, her tear-streaked face filled with panic. "No, please, don't do this. We can go to counseling. We can try to fix it." "It's too late for that," I said firmly. "You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing at the table. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I felt a strange sense of finality. Emma's tears no longer moved me, and her apologies felt hollow. I wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay trapped in the wreckage of our marriage any longer. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Sophie and the possibility of a new beginning. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even clean, but it was a chance to reclaim my life. And for the first time in months, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The day the divorce papers were served was oddly quiet. Emma didn't scream or protest when the courier handed her the envelope. Instead, she sat on the couch, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. I watched her from the kitchen, my emotions tangled between anger, sadness, and relief. She opened the envelope with trembling hands and read through the documents. Her tears began to fall again, but this time, she didn't plead or try to talk to me. She simply nodded to herself, as if finally accepting the inevitable. "This is really it, isn't it?" she said softly, looking up at me. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "It is." Emma wiped her eyes and gave a bitter laugh. I don't even know who I am anymore. I don't know why I did what I did, but I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I doubted I ever would be. But I could acknowledge her apology, even if it came far too late. In the weeks that followed, I began to untangle myself from the life Emma and I had built together. I moved out of the house, unwilling to live in a place tainted by her betrayal. I rented a small apartment across town and started fresh, surrounding myself with things that felt like me instead of us. Sophie became a steady presence in my life, though I kept our relationship quiet at first. She understood my hesitations, never pressuring me for more than I was ready to give. Her patience and kindness were a balm for the wounds Emma had left behind, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Emma, meanwhile, moved out of the house and back to her hometown. We communicated sparingly, mostly through lawyers, as the divorce finalized. There were no dramatic confrontations, no last-minute attempts to reconcile. It ended as quietly as it had begun. A relationship that had once been everything reduced to legal terms and signatures on a page. One evening, months after the dust had settled, I found myself sitting on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the city lights. The air was crisp, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the weight of Emma's betrayal, free from the anger and sadness that had consumed me. I thought about everything I'd been through, the lies, the heartbreak, the desperate attempts to piece together the truth. It had been a brutal, painful journey, but it had also been a necessary one. Emma's betrayal had broken me, but it had also forced me to rebuild, to find strength I hadn't known I possessed. Sophie joined me on the balcony, handing me a mug of tea. She didn't say anything, just sat beside me, her presence a quiet reminder that life goes on, even after the worst of storms. I reached for her hand, grateful for the second chance I'd been given. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was walking towards something instead of away from it. And that was enough. Did I do the right thing? Write your opinion in the comments.